Hey, Get Brocked here. I know it's been a bit since we've had some dedicated Outlands content. Just a bit longer now. We're starting to film shortly for the episodes of the series, so I figured I'd give you just a little more content so you have something to look at and get excited for the series. Today we're going to be talking about different types of cruisers. It's worth noting that a lot of this is dictated by the weapon choice we use in the series. However, I think you'll find a lot of what we say here will apply to other weapons and other mod sets because our weapon set is fairly straightforward, right? We primarily have light weapons, which are generally only good for very small ships or small ships like fighters, bombers, whatever. So basically enhanced point defense. We have medium weapons, which are very good for destroyer on destroyer combat, destroyer on frigate combat, and stuff like this. So high explosive weapons, high fire rate, low caliber. And then finally, we have heavy weapons. Cruisers are created in Outlands are generally considered the most cost-effective capital ship. One of our factions, which has the capability of building battleships, actually refuses to do so because to them, cruisers are considered more cost-effective for their large territory and fleet sizes. Right? The battleship is a very, in a lot of ways, niche weapon system that can only be brought out for specific occasions due to its high value. The cruiser has that nice balance of both effectiveness, acting as a capital ship in a lot of cases, but also cost effectiveness, right? So they come hand in hand to kind of create a very good lethal weapon system. In Outlands, cruisers generally fall into three categories. Well, kind of four categories, but you'll see. In terms of range differences, we have the longest range setup, which is the Siege Cruiser, designed to engage at extreme ranges, usually on stationary targets as a long-range bombardment platform. We have the Artillery Cruiser, which is designed for intermediate range engagements, and the Brawler Cruiser, designed for close-range seek and destroy routing type engagements. It's worth noting, a light cruiser or a heavy cruiser or an armored cruiser can be all of these above, right? Being a light cruiser doesn't make you not necessarily be a brawler or not be an artillery cruiser, whatever, right? The Siege Artillery Brawler is a weapons and design loadout and not necessarily a criteria tied to light or heavy cruisers. Finally, those were three. There's technically four. Finally, there's the I'm afraid of commitment and I want to do it all cruiser, also known as the balanced cruiser, and I'll get to that one as well. Each one of these designations sort of dictates how the cruiser is to be used, but more importantly and realistically, however, these designations are what you strive for when designing the cruiser, right? Very few cruisers are typically designed as a hull and then weapons slapped on. Usually you decide, hey, I want to do the siege role, and thus I'm going to design my cruiser from the ground up to do this role. And if you don't do that, you should consider doing that. And there are a couple ships in the series that are designed to do very specific tasks and excel at it. There's also a lot of ships in the series that are do-it-all ships that were just hulls built from the ground up, and they kind of struggle to find a niche in the series. However, the converse thing is also true, but it, helps my talking point, so we're going to stick with it. In the order I mentioned earlier, the Siege Cruiser. This is actually a very niche, rare type of cruiser, not only because the battleship does this cruiser's job better, bringing more firepower to the fight and higher caliber weapons, but it's also not necessarily worth investing in unless you have a large plethora of cruiser hulls. Don't get me wrong, the siege role is critical, but you can often accomplish the siege role by other ships in the fleet, admittedly not to the same effect, but it can be accomplished enough such that a dedicated cruiser is a ship hull that could be used for different tasks. In Space Engineers, for us, this ship is defined as being a purpose-built platform to engage long-range, one-sided fights against stationary targets. This involves having almost exclusively high-caliber long-range weapons. Specifically, in our series, we have the 1500 Lance and the 400mm turret system for this role, and primarily the 400mm turret system is used for this long-range siege. A siege cruiser can be spotted often by noticing a large percentage of her weapon systems being that heavy caliber main weapon, heavy gun type weapon system. They're also very much designed around having a very distinct broadside for all weapons to engage on. Note, A broadside doesn't actually, in this case, have to be port or starboard. It can be up, down, forward, or I guess technically back. The reasons for this are quite obvious. The siege cruiser is designed around effectively engaging at extreme ranges in a rapid fashion. Why rapid? Because your enemy has a say in what you do, and once the siege cruiser shows up on grid and begins blasting away with her fire mission, she's going to receive counter-artillery fire. Probably from a ship similarly capable or from a stationary target. Furthermore, the enemy will begin to maneuver and act on the fact that a siege cruiser is on the field and do something about it. So the siege cruiser needs to be optimized around this siege capability in engaging and decimating a small target. Right? The siege cruiser's strength comes from its ability to engage 17,000 meters in our universe, using slaved or multiple gunners, depending on their tech level, to take out these priority stationary targets. This has a huge benefit, right? Because this series is very much about a defense, offense, defense, offense. And the ability to just nullify a stationary fob, for example, or a ground target, or anything of this matter, can completely change the dynamic of a battle. For example, that siege cruiser coming in can completely change the battle from being a offense-defense dynamic to a defense-offense dynamic, right? Imagine the siege cruiser rolls up, begins artillery barraging the fob. The defense now has the option of trying to engage in counter-battery fire, which is generally more difficult for the defenders, or switching it up and going on the offense to try to rout out that siege cruiser, right? And then suddenly, they're defending, which is a very beneficial thing because it's a lot easier to shoot assaulting targets. However, this isn't all sunshine, right? Flexibility is the siege cruiser's biggest weakness. Due to the utter extreme priority on maximizing gun broadside, typically having upwards of 100% of main battery weapons being able to shoot simultaneously, the ship can generally only engage in one attack profile, or if it's a broadside, port or starboard broadside, two attack profiles, either port or starboard. There are some ships, like the Warspite, which is a very popular design in the series, can only engage all weapon systems when nose hot on the target. This is a very smart design for siege weapons, because when it's in its siege configuration, shooting all main battery weapons, the ship is actually on its smallest, cross-sectional area, thus counter-battery fire is even less effective because it's shooting a, relatively speaking, smaller target. Okay, so what happens if you try to optimize here? You get the next type of cruiser, the artillery cruiser. Functionally, this is very similar to the siege cruiser. And while the artillery cruiser can effectively do a siege cruiser's job, albeit with less firepower and probably a larger cross-sectional area, the siege cruiser cannot do the artillery cruiser's job. What is that job? The artillery cruiser, which might not be apparent with his name, his job is to actually close formation with her own formation up to about at 5,000, 2,000, typically around 2,500, roughly in that sweet spot where medium weapons struggle to engage, but long distance hasn't really come into effect, and dispersion of inaccuracy hasn't really had time to manifest, if that makes sense. From here, at this 5,000 to 2,000 meter range to target, the 400mm batteries, much like on the siege cruiser, are able to engage priority targets, and the artillery cruiser is able to act as a fire support anchor for a squadron, right? The squadron can pivot around it and defend or assault different objectives. The 400mm in this universe is devastating and is what is generally required to cut through heavy armor. Proper gunnery at about 2,000 meters can result in about a 10, maybe 15% hit rate. This feels really low, but considering both the nature of the 400mm, the devastating nature that most destroyers can only take 2 to 5 shots before they're seriously crippled or need to retreat, this is a really powerful tool because you're actually not in medium weapon range, and you're forcing the onus of action onto your enemy. If the cruiser closes to 1,000 meters, when the fight really begins to close to close quarters range, accuracy skyrockets, and a lot of gunners are reporting upwards of 50% hit rates. This is contrary to other weapons in the series, which struggle to find effectiveness until closing into within brawling ranges, so about 500 meters or so. The artillery cruiser is designed to do this role, thus there are design cues that make an artillery cruiser work well. In a similar vein to siege cruisers, the artillery cruiser needs to maximize main battery fire. So the ability to have most of the main battery centralized so it can all fire at once is critical. However, there's some changes made. The artillery cruiser is almost always going to be receiving counter battery fire. That is, the enemy is going to be shooting back, often with their own artillery cruiser. Thus, the cruiser needs to be able to have a weapon layout that allows maximum firepower on the table, while also allowing movement and having free firing arcs. This almost always means the battery system needs to be set up either to engage port, starboard, or typically both. This means good firing arcs. These turrets must be localized, meaning most can be brought to bear, but the ship needs to typically be on the move at either 1/4 speed, half speed, or even full speed, engaging targets, right, shooting perpendicularly. Because of the high value nature of a cruiser, it's a capital ship, it's going to be the focus of the battle. Thus, the cruiser must be on a dime, ready to either assault a target that presents itself as an optimal kill target, right, chasing down a routed target. So that is, the turrets still need to be engaged when the cruiser is pursuing a target, so nose hot. Similarly, the cruiser must be able to increase the range if it notices it's being closed on, so turning away from the battlefield and still being able to keep up fire and support her own vessels in the fight. This is by far, thus, the most difficult ship to design due to having 3 attack profiles being required, right? The ability to engage in a full broadside, the ability to engage a fleeing target by chasing it, and the ability to flee and continue to keep up the pressure. Right? And a lot of ships struggle to hit all 3 of these profiles. Finally, the ship must be able to survive a decent degree of counter battery fire that are going to inevitably be hits, right? Because it's going to be in the thick of it to a degree. Thus, you get the kind of best cruiser, in my opinion. This cruiser is centered around being an anti-capital ship killer, designed to engage other cruisers, battleships, obviously with support, and occasionally a destroyer that kind of falls into optimal weapon range, though that is never the goal with this type of cruiser. Finally, the artillery cruiser allows for semi-effective siege capabilities, though this often comes at the cost of needing to open up a broadside, meaning it's significantly larger for counter artillery fire, right? Remember that Warspite example with a very narrow profile? The ship needs to be able to ebb and flow with battle, and generally requires one of the most skilled, if not the skilled pilot in the formation to pilot said ship, lest she be overrun. Finally, the brawler. The brawler exists around the conundrum. Destroyers are annoying and cheap, and I want destroyers to go away so I can deal with the mission at hand. That is what the brawler is designed to do. The brawler is designed to leverage her heavy caliber weapons and her high weapon count and surface area to allow said weapons to just devastate destroyers. Destroyers are almost exclusively armed with medium weapons, thus they have issues getting through a cruiser's bulk and heavy armor. So the brawler, so while the other ships I've mentioned so far might be the anchor, the brawler is the spear. Because her weapons are now dispersed throughout the ship, the vessel has 360 continuous fire, something not achievable by a siege or an artillery cruiser by design. This dispersed weaponry means localized damage per second is actually quite low, and also the lack of heavy weapons means her damage goes down further. However, that doesn't matter when fighting destroyers, which are generally quite weak under sustained fire. So if a cruiser gets in a destroyer's face, it doesn't matter where that destroyer goes. The cruiser will be able to keep up, and the destroyer will be always within at least a third of the ship's weapon systems at one time, generally withering and dying due to this. Finally, real quick, the balanced cruiser. There's not too much to say here. This is the vessel that kind of has a decent-sized main battery, generally 5 barrels or so, maybe 6 or 7, dispersed weaponry. It might choose some design cues from all the different categories, right? I would say the Warspite is kind of, it'll choose design cues from all the different categories, right? It might be designed to have a very narrow attack profile, very good in offense, but weak in defense, or it might have very good AA, because it needs to be AA. These vessels generally often feel like a hindrance compared to purpose-built formations. However, they do serve some purpose, namely in peacekeeping, heavy escort, and flagships in a already stacked formation, right? A versatile linchpin that you can send somewhere to do a job that you don't necessarily know beforehand that needs filled, right? So that cruiser can act as kind of a stopgap to do whatever you need it to do that a artillery or a siege cruiser might not be able to do. And this is generally only in stacked formations, right? Capital heavy formations. All right, hopefully that kind of helped you out to understand cruiser design, right? There are obviously more to this, and it's very infrequent that a siege cruiser doesn't have artillery cruiser design cues, and an artillery cruiser doesn't have some brawler design cues, and so on and so forth. That's not the point. These are just design considerations. But it is worth noting that the balanced cruiser is typically viewed and is often, in practice, one of the weaker designs. And that is to say, if you try to create a cruiser that does it all, you'll end up with a cruiser that can't really do anything. And specializing in a certain task, right? That medium range engagement with the artillery cruiser, or that long, hyper long range engagement with the design for stationary targets with the siege cruiser, or the ability to just dumpster destroyers with the brawler cruiser. If you don't focus on this stuff, you'll often find yourself withering to enemies that did focus on this and are meeting you with significant firepower advantages due to being purpose-built. Okay, that's been more than enough. We'll cut it here short, or we'll cut it here. Thanks for watching the video. Real quick before I send you off, I need to thank my patrons for a second. You guys are sticking with it, even though I'm not producing that much content right now. I appreciate it. We got new Outlands content coming real soon, so stick around for that. Finally, you, the viewers, hey man, thanks for watching. Thanks for commenting. It's always fun reading your comments, but hey, we'll see you guys around. Consider heading over to Discord if you want to keep up this talk, and have a nice day.